Hi students, good afternoon. This is Mr. Teng here. Today we're going to carry on with our chapter 2 and we're going to try to finish chapter 2 today. I hope you have your slides with you. Can you please take it out right now? Okay, let us begin. We'll start with a recap of what we've covered so far in chapter 2. We first started chapter 2 by talking about why the British were involved in Southeast Asia. Okay, and we learned that there were two reasons for why the British were involved in Southeast Asia. One is that they were interested in the India-China trade, and why is that so is because the trade between India and China was the most profitable trade route for the British, and so it was important for them to really protect it or find ways to protect it. The second reason is the interest in the spice trade. Okay, and as we've learned about spices, there are many different types, and because of this interest, right, spices are actually very useful, right? They, medicines, preservatives. You could preserve these spices. So because of how useful it is, it was in very high demand, especially in Europe. You know, and being high in demand is expensive, and it soon became an indication of one's wealth. Okay. Next, we talk about the problems the British East India Company faced in Southeast Asia. The British were just entering Southeast Asia and they were looking for new ports. They're trying to establish a new trade port that would help them to take part in the spice trade and also protect the India China trade route as well. But they had problems that they faced. So, one problem is that the Dutch controlled the spice trade. Okay, the Dutch actually have a monopoly over spice trade in Southeast Asia. They control a lot of the waterways into Southeast Asia, and this actually prevented the British from trading freely. Another problem that the British faced was that existing British ports were not suitable, and ports like Penang and Bencoolen were not in the best location to take advantage of trade in Southeast Asia and not being able to provide protection over British ships. Okay, so these were the two areas that we covered the previous lessons. Today we're going to move forward with learning more about Singapore, what aspects of Singapore were good or were ideal for the British, and as well as how did Raffles, this new man that we learn about, Sir Stamford Raffles, how did he set up and gain the British a new trade port in Singapore Island? Then after that, we will learn about the responses. How did the British feel about the new port in Singapore? How did the Dutch feel about the new port in Singapore? Okay, so let us begin. We'll start off with a video.
In their attempt to establish a trading post at the southern end of the Straits of Malacca, Stamford Raffles and William Farquhar faced many obstacles. On January 8, 1819, Raffles sent a letter to Lord Hastings, the Governor-General of British India. Raffles was concerned that the Dutch would extend their influences over the whole of the ancient territories of Johor and thwart British trade with China. Lord Hastings gave the go-ahead for Raffles to explore the possibility of a trading post in this part of the region, but cautioned that they should not incite Dutch anger in the process. The first location that Raffles's men considered was the Karimun Islands. But when Colonel Bannerman, the acting governor of Penang, heard this, he was livid and demanded Raffles halt his expedition. After all, the area was under his jurisdiction. Raffles agreed to Bannerman's request, but then set off by boats in the dead of night to join Farquhar and the survey ships that had gone in advance. It was no secret that Farquhar favored the Karimun Islands, having earlier signed the treaty to establish a port there, but everyone else thought the rocky island and inhospitable harbor was unsuitable. It was at this point that Captain Daniel Ross suggested they head for Singapore. Within days of arrival, they were impressed by Singapore's sheltered harbor and accessible drinking water. They also found that they might be able to come to an agreement with local rulers. On 15th February 1819, Raffles wrote again to Lord Hastings. A British station has been established in the Straits of Singapore in the vicinity of Johor, in a situation combining every advantage of geographical and local which we could desire. And thus began British rule over Singapore for the next 144 years.
Now that you've watched video number 1, you've learnt about how Singapore came to be in the eyes of the British. Okay, and we're going to learn more about the qualities that Singapore possessed that made it an ideal trading port. Okay, and there are three. One is that Singapore had a natural sheltered harbor. All right, this harbor allowed the British ships to be protected from storms due to the monsoons that occur during certain times of the year. Number two, Singapore had a good supply of drinking water. Okay, it helped to replenish water for trade ships traveling long journeys between China and India. And the last one, Singapore had a very good location, very convenient, strategic. Right, Singapore is located at the southern tip of the Straits of Malacca, which meant that Singapore could be the halfway port between India and China. This makes Singapore a convenient location as a stopover port for trade and ship services. Next, let us watch video number 2. You can click on your Google Classroom for video number 2.
On 6 February 1819, Singapore's fate was forever changed. A treaty was signed that day by three men, Stamford Raffles, Sultan Hussein, and Temenggung Abdul Rahman. Just 9 days earlier, on 28th January, the British had arrived in Singapore, just off St. John's Island. They had come to the end of their search for a location for a trading post, hoping to break the Dutch stranglehold over trade in the region. As Raffles once wrote, the Dutch possess the only passes through which ships must sail, and the British have now not an inch of ground to stand upon. The hunt for a foothold had taken the British to various places, including the Karimun Islands. It was Captain Daniel Ross who suggested a promising site at the mouth of the Singapore River. When they arrived, they found no Dutch presence on the island. Relieved, they decided to establish a trading base here. Sultan Hussein, a crown prince of the Johor Riau Lingga Sultanate, was embroiled in a succession struggle with his half-brother, Sultan Abdul Rahman. At the time, Singapore was part of the Sultanate. The Temenggung Abdul Rahman was Sultan Hussein's brother-in-law and firm supporter in the struggle. Contrary to prior agreement with the Dutch, Sultan Hussein and the Temenggung agreed to allow the British to set up a trading post on a small strip of land, calculated as the distance of a cannon shot at the mouth of the Singapore River. Sultan Hussein was paid an annual sum of 5,000 Spanish dollars, and the Temenggung 3,000. The protagonists could not have known it then, but this agreement set Singapore on a vastly different trajectory for the next 200 years.
Now that we've watched video number 2, we will now read more and learn more about how did the British establish a trading post in Singapore. Establishing a trading post in Singapore was not easy for the British. On 29th January 1819, Raffles and Farquhar met Temenggung Abdul Rahman, informing him that the British East India Company wanted to set up a trading post in Singapore. However, the Temenggung said that he had no authority to grant permission to the British East India Company. Only the Sultan could do that. Singapore at that time was part of the Johor Riau Sultanate and a vassal of the Dutch, meaning that the Dutch were influencing and controlling the Johor Riau Sultanate. So let us read on the succession dispute and Raffles' actions and solutions to how he established a port in Singapore. So what did Raffles do? Raffles invited the Temenggung to Singapore. He promised him protection and financial assistance. So on the 6th of February 1819, Raffles signed an agreement to allow the British to build a trading post in Singapore, and in return, the Temenggung and Sultan Hussein would receive annual payments as compensation. The British also agreed to protect and support them if they agreed not to make any treaties with other European nations. So, next, we're going to learn about the responses. How did the Dutch and the British respond to what has happened? Okay, the Dutch, as expected, were very angry at the British for establishing a trading post in Singapore. Okay, the Dutch did not agree with Raffles' action. They claimed that Singapore belongs to the Johor Riau, which was under the Dutch influence. On the other hand, the British government were initially upset at Raffles, all right, as his actions actually threatened the friendship with the Dutch. However, the British were eventually convinced of the need for a British trading post in Singapore to challenge the Dutch in the area around the Straits of Malacca. So Singapore was needed to protect and expand British trade in the East. And so this dispute between the Dutch and the British lasted several years. However, despite the hostility, despite not being very friendly with one another, no war was declared between them. Both the British and the Dutch did not fight each other. Both governments stayed on friendly terms, and there are 2 points as to why they stayed on friendly terms. One, for the British, war actually was taking place in Europe, and it actually showed the British that countries like the Netherlands, which were the Dutch, were actually important to defense and security of Britain, their home country. So it was important for them that the British had the Dutch as an ally, okay, in case of future threats. For the Dutch, on the other hand, the wars in Europe actually disrupted a lot of their trade and shipping very badly. Okay, the Dutch had become bankrupt, right? They may control a lot of the trade in Southeast Asia, but they became bankrupt. And when you have no money, you have to borrow. And they borrowed a lot of money from the British. Okay, so the Dutch did not want to be involved in more wars as it can harm their economy as well as their friendship with the British. Okay, so therefore, the Dutch and the British agreed to settle their disputes with 2 treaties. The first one is the 1824 Anglo-Dutch Treaty, and the second one is the 1824 Treaty of Friendship and Alliance. Okay, we will be looking at these 2 treaties next. So let's recap what we've learned today. Okay, we first covered on 2 reasons why the British were involved in Southeast Asia. All right, they were interested in the India-China trade as well as the spice trade. Then we talk about the problems that the British East India Company face. The Dutch controlled the spice trade and that British ports were not suitable. Then we covered on the suitability of Singapore. There were 3 points that we covered. Singapore had a natural sheltered harbour, had access to drinking water, and it was in a convenient location. So this made Singapore very suitable to be a trade port. Then we talk about British actions. What did Raffles do to set up a trading post in Singapore? And lastly, what was the response by the British and the Dutch to the setting up of a trading port in Singapore? Okay, so this is what we've covered today. Do make sure you revise your work, all right, and attempt the quiz at the end. And in your WA2, Chapter 2 will be tested. So I hope you can do your best to revise your work.